headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
It's a happy day. COVID rules to be abolished in England. Not such good news in Scotland, where Nicola Sturgeon has announced a 6-month extension to the rules. We were going to see that COVID legislation, the emergency legislation, end on the 24th of March. I don't think anyone expected the Prime Minister to have the ability, even if he wanted to extend that legislation, given the mutiny there would be on his back benches. But is it dangerous? Is it unscientific? Is it risky for him to end those rules on February the 24th?
Well, I think the first thing is to say what a remarkable turnaround of events. As you know, 18th of December, only 8 weeks ago, we were talking about banning indoor mixing. Again, the modelers were producing scenarios that were saying, look, this is going to be a very bad winter. Actually, the exact opposite has happened. And what we've seen time and time again is these models that predict the worst case scenario and then a reality that happens, that actually viruses will take care of themselves. Yes, they go up. At that period, there's a high risk, but then they come down, they wane in a process that has happened over time. I think what's happened here, you outlined all of these restrictions. There was an assertion that restrictions were cost-free. Somehow they weren't going to cost us any in society. Now, I want to give you just a figure that we looked at, an assumption here. The cost of testing to you, Julia. We think it's about, an assumption is it's just the testing alone has been about £15 billion throughout this pandemic. That worked out for the 30 million plus taxpayers. You as an individual, about £500 you have contributed to testing. Now, people who are going to call for continuation of that, the government's going to have to find more money from somewhere, and it doesn't have it, because I'm looking at this leaked report from the NHS saying waiting lists are going to get near 9-10 million. Now, if we don't actually get focused on the matters that actually are important to us. So what also you've outlined, I think there are two distinct things happening here. There's a group of people who are out and about, and there's a group of people who are still hidden behind those computers. And actually, you need to get out into the world now, and we need to move on.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always fascinated by, especially some of the biggest doom mongers who stick to those models, even when they are blatantly proved to be, I mean, so beyond wrong that it's almost laughable if it wasn't so serious. Tweeting, and someone did it the other day again, saying, on my first train in 2 years, so excited to be leaving home. And you think, oh my God, millions of us have been out and about, even during lockdown 1, when I was one of the people who was stuck at home during that one, as millions of my listeners were. There were still millions of people who went out to work. Or did people think that, the Amazon fairies were making all those products and that the shelves of the supermarkets were being stocked by elves? Millions of people carried on working throughout. And it seems to me there is a really big difference in society right now. And a lot of it, I think, is almost like private sector, public sector, but also working class and middle class. And we see this with the truckers in Canada as well, and workers in Italy and Australia who's standing up against things like mandated jabs, which is that there are millions of people who've been out and about, who've been working, who want to just get on with normal life, who probably had COVID, like me, twice, and accept there is a risk, but it's a risk they're willing to take, and it's not so serious unless you are elderly or vulnerable or overweight. And yet there's an awful lot of people, millions of them, who've been working from home, who are sitting on their laptops, been on full pay, who've not been out and about, who've not, gone on holiday, who've not been on trains or gone to parties, who are still scared out of their minds. Should they be, though?
So I think there are two things there. I think you're right, Julia. I think I worked in urgent care, and actually going into the workplace was actually therapeutic compared to actually sitting behind a computer and watching these graphs where the lines just kept going up and up. And I think for those people who have not been in for 2 years, they should consider it as part of their rehabilitation to go back into the workplace, because it's good for us to be connected socially. The second issue is we are going to have to get used to the fact that actually when you do get respiratory pathogens, yes, you feel unwell. You felt unwell about a month ago when you got Omicron. Now, with that, some people will face complications, but that's a natural part of life. And in fact, one of the treatments or one of the preventers is facing these pathogens on a regular occasion means that actually they will be milder each time you face them. Now, I look at the estimates and it looks like over 2/3 of the country have probably had the infection now. If you go on the case data, it's about a third. If you go at the ONS, it's more than 2/3. So just in the middle, it's about 2/3 of us. So I suspect there's about a third of people who have dodged this, still thinking anxiously, if I stay at home, I could dodge this. But the longer you create that immunity gap, the potential it might be worse for you in the future. So at some point, you're going to have to rejoin society. And right now, the figures are better than what they normally are in a winter period when we face the...
We have fewer people dying than we normally would, don't we? And this is it, the most controversial of those rules being abolished. And in fact, I mean, probably the only one mostly affecting people right now. Of course, unjabbed have still been affected by a lot of restrictions in terms of travel. But it's the self-isolation rule. And, you know, even I sort of went, oh, really? We're not going to have that rule? What is the scientific evidence for people being... forced to self-isolate for a minimum of 5 days if they test positive for COVID with or without symptoms? And what's the scientific evidence for people not being forced to do that?
So it's an interesting concept. If you look at all the other pandemics, the difference now is we've got PCR testing. So all the other pandemics had to come to a natural end and people had to use what we call common sense.
Oh, sorry, I don't. What's that? That's a new concept.
Yeah.
What's that?
So, well, it's something I think we're going to have to relearn and revisit. That actually, when you're symptomatically unwell, you stay at home, you go to bed, and you wait until you're well. And that actually is the way we should go forward.
What about all the we're told that the asymptomatic, something like with Omicron, it's up to 40% of people, they can have it, and it's only if they're regularly testing themselves on lateral flow they'll discover they've got it, but they can pass it on to someone unknowingly. And if they're out and about when they know they've got it, they're a risk to people, particularly the vulnerable.
But look, if you look at it, we've had all this test and trace and isolation, and 2/3 of the population have still got the infection. So you've got to ask questions about what actually is it doing. At the time of testing, about a third, if not a half of people are not contagious. So we have shut down the economy. We have stopped people going about their daily lives. Remember, at the height, it was 2 weeks, and you could end up at 4 weeks if you tested at the end of somebody else in your house, who then got the infection at the end of that. So we potentially locked people up when they did feel unwell, but weren't infectious. The whole structure, the whole 38 billion we've paid for has not actually affected what happened next, because a huge swathe of the population has now got the infection. So we're just going to have clear guidance where people are going to have to understand when they're symptomatic, we're going to have to stay in bed, isolate, and that guidance needs to be just very simple and very clear for once. Because
it's very interesting, because this was what World Health Organization guidance was for pandemics before 2019. I mean, just finally, in terms of the vulnerable, the elderly, those who are at high risk, some people are saying, well, OK, great, so I'm now going to have to be in hiding because all these people are going to be out and about. And if life goes back to normal, my life becomes even less normal. I mean, we're not talking about a few hundred people. We are talking about millions and millions of people in this situation. What would you say to them?
Well, I think there's a lesson when the viruses are on the rise in that exponential phase, which lasts about 2 to 4 weeks, and then it comes off. There is about an 8 to 10 week period where you're at significantly more risk of catching a respiratory pathogen. I think guidance should let people know, and they make decisions in that period. But the flip side to that is there will come a point when your risk goes much better. And as it gets warmer, you can be outside more, and that will be next month. Actually, you'll be able to go about your life much more so. So I think if you're really anxious, you could wait a couple of weeks and then start to re-emerge. And when you can be outdoors more and feel more confident and more safe as you go about your daily life.
Professor Carl Heneghan, thank you very much indeed. Always such a pleasure to have you on the show.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.